Take it to you.
It's Book TV's 5th anniversary fall, and this weekend we're in Boston for the Boston Globe Book Fair. Betrayal, the Crisis in the Catholic Church is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. And you're looking live inside the Old South Boston Meeting House, where members of the team will discuss the scandal and its ongoing impact on the church. This is live coverage on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Good afternoon from the Old South Meeting House in Boston, and welcome to today's program of the Boston Globe Book Festival, our annual celebration of great writing and great reading. My name is David Mehegan from the Globe staff. Our series continues tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Charles Hotel in Cambridge as novelist William Martin reads from his new book, Harvard Yard, and next Wednesday night at 6 p.m. at Boston's Faneuil Hall with Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. The center of today's program is a book entitled Betrayal, The Crisis in the Catholic Church, by 6 members of the Globe staff, with whom I will introduce to you in a moment. It gives me great pleasure, is the usual phrase in introductions such as these, but I suspect that pleasant is not the apt word for the work these reporters and authors have done over the last 2 years. I am sure they would say that it was satisfying and rewarding, but also appalling, revolting, and dispiriting. Probably not pleasant. In the hundreds of stories which they wrote, and in the book that followed, they painfully and painstakingly documented the sexual abuse of children by dozens of Catholic priests in the Archdiocese of Boston over the last generation and more. They revealed as well the pattern of denial, enabling, and cover-up by church leadership, revelations which have led to the profound changes in the Catholic Church in the Boston area and in the United States. Their reporting and disclosures resulted in an unprecedented resignation of a Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, and it earned for them and the Globe the 2003 Pulitzer Prize in Journalism for Public Service. Speaking as one who knew 3 of the abusive priests personally and never would have suspected them, I need not tell you that the shock of these disclosures can hardly be overstated. The repercussions of the loss of trust will be felt for years to come in the church and in the community generally. Leading our presentation today is Walter Robinson, leader of the investigative group known as the Boston Globe Spotlight Team. And to my right, in order, are several Globe writers who contributed to this project and the book: Sasha Pfeiffer, Stephen Kirkjian, Tom Farragher, Kevin Cullen, and Michael Paulson. There will be time for questions after their remarks, and I would ask those who have questions to come to the microphone so that the broadcast audience can hear you. And there will be a book signing after the program as well. I invite you now, please, to welcome and to listen to the authors of Betrayal, the Crisis in the Catholic Church. Walter Robinson.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind and warm introduction. And our thanks from the Globe to all of you for being inside this historic place on what may be one of the last autumn days here in Boston that can be spent outdoors without wool socks. It may seem odd to have 6 journalists all up here together to discuss just one book. In fact, the book has 8 authors. 2 of us, Matt Carroll and Michael Resendez, could not be here today. For the book's publisher, there were so many writers involved that our names were shuffled off to the back cover of the hardcover edition. and when the paperback was published, our names disappeared inside, buried at the bottom of the acknowledgments on page 276. That's page 276, in case anybody's looking. But I suppose that's rough justice. The book is, after all, an effort not by any one of us, or even just the 8 of us, but it's an obligation we all felt at the Globe, in the midst of a turbulent moment in the Church's history, to pause ever so briefly to put together the story in the larger context it deserved. Before my colleagues give you a hint of what's in the book, let me briefly set the context. The Globe's investigative team set out in mid-2001 to investigate the case of the notorious priest pedophile John Gagan, whose recent murder in prison is yet another horrific punctuation mark in the evolution of this scandal. Back in 2001, our assignment was to determine how much the Church knew about his serial molestation of so many children over so many years. What we quickly discovered was that Gagan was only one among scores of priests whose sexual abuse of children had been covered up for decades by a succession of Boston cardinals and bishops. Today, almost 2 years after we began publishing extensive stories about this, we know that in this archdiocese alone, more than 200 priests have faced credible allegations of sexual abuse over 60 years. In 2002, the Globe published more than 800 news stories about the scandal, the vast bulk of them written by the 8 of us. In early April, in a moment of weakness, we allowed a senior editor to convince us that the news story was ebbing and that we ought to write a book. And in less than 5 weeks, we did, even as we discovered the story was not ebbing at all. Even now, 16 months after the book was published, it retains all of its relevancy. It contains much of the history, background, context, nuance, and detail that cannot be easily shoehorned into any number of news stories. For the next 20 minutes, my colleagues who did most of the writing will tell you about some of the book's highlights, and then we will be happy to take your questions for the balance of our time. Kevin Cullen will start with an explanation of the church culture that helped to make such a long-running cover-up possible. Kevin?
Thanks, Robert. We were often asked during the reporting and the writing of the book and after why this story took so long to come out, and why did it come out when it came out in the Globe. Actually, the whole story, the issue of clergy sexual abuse, had been kicking around in this country since the mid-1980s. But it was a story that was always treated as an isolated incident, and the Catholic hierarchy had its interest in having it seen that way. One case that we dealt with in the book and in our reporting was in 1991, when the case of a former priest named James Porter, who had molested hundreds of children, came to light. He was a priest in the Fall River Diocese. That case was dealt with as an isolated case. And in fact, when the reporting of the Globe and others sought to suggest that it might be more than that, Cardinal Law suggested that it was part of an anti-Catholic agenda, and that this was something that, as he said, he called the power of God down on the media, and especially the Boston Globe. And most Catholics were prepared to accept that. They did see that maybe as piling on, that there was maybe too many stories about one case. What changed in the 10 years between the Porter case and when the Spotlight team exposed in 2001 the numbers involved and showed beyond a reasonable doubt that this was not isolated, that it was widespread, and that this was covered up, is that ordinary Catholics responded. They were the ones who were talking about this at Mass. They were the ones who were talking among themselves and reading the stories. And it wasn't what the Globe said. It was the records that the Globe obtained. It was the Church's own words. It was the Cardinal's own words. And those are words that held comfort for the abusers and none for the abused. And that resonated with ordinary Catholics. So that became an internal pressure, which continued on. And one of the stories, the episodes we tell in the book, was in February of 2001, when Cardinal Law convened what you would call a kitchen cabinet, ad hoc advisors, very powerful people in business and finance. And these people included Jack Connors, the founder of the biggest ad agency in town, Tommy O'Neill, the son of Tip O'Neill, an ad man himself, Paul LaCamera, the president and general manager of the ABC affiliate in town. These are people who have raised millions of dollars for the good work of the church, and these were people who told the cardinal in no uncertain terms that they felt like he had not been straight with them, that this scandal was bigger than they ever imagined, that the numbers involved were bigger than they had been led to believe. And if the cardinal learned that night that this was not going to be a support group, it was a group that actually suggested he needed to resign. Now that was an internal pressure. There was also an external pressure. The culture of deference that existed in a place like Boston, where half of the people in this metropolitan area are Catholic, extended to places of power, like the legal profession, law enforcement, business, all those areas. These were people who before were not prepared to challenge their own bishops and their own priests over something like this. What changed in an episode we told was the case of the Attorney General. Tom Riley, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, grew up in a devoutly Catholic home. Until the day he left for college when he was 18, he was expected to be home every night to kneel down and say the rosary with his family at 7 p.m. Fast forward to 2001, Tom Riley, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, was prepared and tried to get his bishop indicted for enabling some of these priests to abuse children. That is how much the culture of deference that existed in this region had collapsed in the face of the revelations that came out in the Boston Globe and then in other media. And that was some of the episodes, some of the cases we tried to highlight in the book that would show sort of that this was not just a scandal involving sexual abuse and a cover-up. It was a cultural phenomenon, that attitudes among people were changing. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Kevin. Steve Kirkshin will now give you some details about how the Archdiocese carried out this cover-up for so long. Steve?
Thank you, Rob. The deference that Kevin alluded to had its greatest effect within the Massachusetts legislature. The Massachusetts legislature was not alone as showing that deference to the church. In legislatures throughout the country, the dioceses and archdioceses had been excluded from abuse, from reporting allegations of abuse against children. Through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when now we know instances of abuse were great, very few of the cases made their way to the public or law enforcement's attention. Why? Because very few of those states required the clergy of those states, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim alike, to report allegations of abuse to authorities. In Massachusetts, even though there had been a statute on the books that had required professionals in other areas, social work, medicine, teachers, when they learned of allegations of abuse, they were required to inform both the DSS, Department of Social Services, as well as the local authorities of an allegation. And if they didn't, there could be criminal penalties against that neglect. That wasn't the case, though, in Massachusetts, as far as the clergy was concerned. To avoid bringing dreaded scandal in church, its leaders, cardinals, bishops, worked out a scheme. The few times that a parent of a victim would go to the church and complain, the church would quickly place the offending priest on sick leave, but soon enough transfer him to another parish. The family of the victim was assured that the problem had been severely dealt with, and to make up for the harm suffered to their child, a cash settlement was offered. Though the circumstances of the abuse may have been different, case after case, one paragraph in those settlements was always the same: a secrecy agreement that emphasized that the victim and his family would forsake the money, would have to in fact give it back if they ever made the settlement known. that allowed the scandal to stay hidden, because very few of these people, none of these families or victims, had any idea of the extent of the abuse. In fact, only those within the archdiocese in Boston knew the extent of the abuse. In 1992, however, that situation changed. A group of victims of Father James Porter from Fall River stepped forward to say they had been abused by the priest, and they wanted the world to know what had happened. Cardinal Bernard Law, as Kevin mentioned, expressed outrage over the wide coverage that case, the papers, including the Globe, gave to that case, and raised questions about why were we picking on the church. He called on the power of God on the media, including the Globe, to cease its critical reporting. I was one of the reporters at the Globe who was working on the case at that time, and I have to admit, not hearing from people, other victims, I had to think that, well, I know the church had not lived up to its responsibilities in this case. Their bishops knew what Porter was up to and hadn't removed him immediately, had tolerated the abuse. But I myself thought that this was just a singular case. But it turned out it wasn't. Cardinal Law put into effect a new policy that was highly touted at the time, and he opened his arms, the church's doors to any victims. But one point he kept in place, just as ever, and that was none of the cases of abuse that was reported to the church, none of the victims who had come forward at allegations of abuse would be made known to authorities. So for the next 10 years, the scandal stayed hidden. The church spent millions and millions in secret settlements. The church kept their secret hidden. The victims were paid off believing that it was a singular case, they themselves, again, a singular case, and their lawyers themselves benefited. But the story stayed hidden until the summer of 2000 and 2001, when the case of John Gagan became to our attention.
Thank you very much, Steve. Next, in succession, Tom Farragher and then Sasha Pfeiffer will talk first. Tom's case about the victims, and Sasha about some of the perpetrators who took advantage of their positions to abuse so many children. Tom?
Thank you, Robbie. Steve gives me a good segue into what I wanted to speak about. One of the mandates that our editor gave us when we were tasked with the somewhat daunting duty of writing the book was that this not be a recapitulation of the Globe's reporting that we do to the degree that we could in the time we had, original reporting. And I was asked to write about Father Gagan in part. And just as we were sort of crunching on the book, I needed a sort of a lead anecdote, so I interviewed one of his victims at a park not far from where we're sitting today, Frank Leary, who was the lead plaintiff in the civil cases against Father Gagan. And he told me a story that would be familiar to any victim of the many people that Gagan abused, and that is of being a 10-year-old kid in a church in Forest Hills and seeing this sort of smiling, somewhat timid, somewhat giggly, actually, priest in the back of the church who mothers seemed to love and fathers seemed to keep their distance from, and children didn't quite know what to make of him. He told the story of being a rectory groundskeeper on a hot summer day back, again, in the early 70s when Father Gagan bounded down the steps of the rectory and offered him lemonade, and Frank said, "No thanks, I don't like lemonade." And Gagan insisted and said, "Come on in, I want to show you my stamp collection." And within minutes they were in Father Gagan's bedroom in the rectory, and Frank tells the story about him looking at a stamp collection that didn't interest him at all, and Father Gagan approaching him from behind and having the boy sit on his lap, and then fondling him through his gym shorts that day. an episode that was repeated a week or so later. I also wanted to tell you the story about another victim that, among the many that we interviewed for the book and for our reporting. Very early on, Sasha and I did a story about Father Joseph Birmingham, who was a priest in suburban Boston here in Lowell and Salem and other places. One of his victims was a guy by the name of Tom Blanchette. Tom Blanchette today is a self-employed contractor on Martha's Vineyard. And for years after his abuse by Father Birmingham, he simmered and found himself sort of with a hair-trigger temper and couldn't quite figure out why he was angry, and sometimes that anger would boil over. He tells a story about rolling around the New Jersey Turnpike with a state trooper and thinking, my God, what am I doing? What's happening to me? Anyhow, after 20 years or so, he decides to confront his demons, and he tracks Birmingham down, who by then was living in a rectory in historic Lexington. And he talks about approaching Birmingham from across the parking lot as the priest, by then quite older than Blanchette remembers him as a kid, was getting out of his car. And he went up and he said, Father Birmingham, do you remember me? I'm Tommy Blanchette. And he said the priest was sort of frozen, and eventually invited him into the rectory. They had a conversation, and finally Birmingham said to him, why are you here? What do you want from me? And Blanchette said, I want to ask you to forgive me for the hatred I've had for you over the past 40 years. It was a very powerful story. It turns out that Father Birmingham, shortly after that, was dying. And Blanchette kept up his relationship with him, or at least kept in touch either by mail or occasional visits. And on his last visit, he went to the rectory in Lexington, and the pastor said, no, Father Birmingham's not here. He's in the hospital. Blanchette said, can I visit him? And the pastor said, I can't give you permission or deny you permission, but he did. He went to the hospital just a little bit north of where we are right now. And Birmingham was in his sick bed. He had a morphine IV. He had an oxygen mask on. He was dying. In fact, he did die that night with Tom Blanchette holding his hand and asking God to forgive this man who he said abused him many, many times. As I say, Father Birmingham died the next morning. Tom Blanchette went to Father Birmingham's funeral, which was officiated by Cardinal Law. After the funeral, Blanchette approached Cardinal Law and said, Cardinal, you're going to have some trouble as a result of Father Birmingham's abuse. And according to Blanchette, Cardinal Law said, what do you mean? What are you getting at? And Blanchette said, well, he abused me, and he abused my brothers, and he abused many, many people at the parishes where he served. According, again, to Blanchette, Cardinal Law at that point said, can I pray for you? And Blanchette said, sure. And he said, Cardinal Law said some prayers and then placed his hand over Blanchette's head and said, I now bind you by the power of the confessional never to speak of this again. Blanchette was outraged by that because he said he didn't come to have Cardinal Law say his confession, but just to give him a warning. When Sasha and I reported that on the front page of the Globe one Sunday a year and a half ago, Blanchette read it, and he read the part where we had sought a response from the Chancery, and Cardinal Law's spokeswoman said he did not remember that episode the way Tom Blanchette does, but he'd be happy to meet with Tom if he would want to come to the Chancery. Blanchette, being sort of a very practical man, jumped on the ferry at Martha's Vineyard the next morning on Monday and drove to the Chancery, knocked on the door, and said, Cardinal Law says he wants to meet with me. I'd like to meet with him. And he was told, no, you need an appointment. You can't meet with him. The Cardinal Secretary came down and tried to sort of put him off, I guess. And at any rate, Cardinal Law did not meet with Tom Blanchette, as he said he would, until many, many months later when the end was in sight for the Cardinal. And that was when Tom Blanchette finally got to confront Cardinal Law about that episode.
Tom, thank you very much. And if I hadn't leaped to the podium, if we'd gone on about this, Tom would have told you that when all the documents came out, there was extraordinarily and extensive documentation that the Archdiocese had known for years, going back to the early 60s, about Father Birmingham's abuse. Sasha Pfeiffer will now talk about some of the perpetrators. Thank you.
First, I want to say I speak too quickly, and knowing that I only have about 4 minutes, I'll probably speak even more quickly. So I'll try to go slowly, but if I start to cruise, please flag me down. One of the things we talked about a lot when we were doing our reporting was how we present this abuse in a way that would never be accused, that we couldn't be accused of being salacious or of sensationalizing what we were writing about, because in many cases we were writing about, obviously, sexual encounters. And we developed this sort of expression among ourselves that molest is not a 6-letter word. And what we meant by that was we wanted not to have people think of this word molest and forget the details of what that meant. Because in every case it was different. It was very skillful. It was very manipulative. These were carefully cultivated relationships that began often with emotional bonds and eventually became physical. For many of these kids, it was the first time they'd ever had any experience with sex. I wrote a story once about a boy who had had a sexual relationship with a priest for several years. The day that story ran, I got a very angry call from a man who said if that relationship went on for several years, it absolutely was consensual. And then he offered this example. He said when he was younger, he had been skinny dipping in a quarry on the South Shore. At one point, he was alone at this quarry, and the stranger came up and grabbed him. And he said, when that happened to me, I knew to run away as fast as I could. But, you know, the guy was missing the point, which is that these weren't strangers grabbing you in a strange place. These were relationships that were taken very slowly and very carefully. So in our newspaper stories, we were very limited by both time and space and how much detail we could offer. One of the nice things about the book is that we could actually write about some of these priests and some of the cases of abuse in detail. There's a chapter called Predators in which we profile about 5 of the worst offenders in the Boston Archdiocese, and then one nationally, Robert Trupia in Arizona. We wrote about Gagan, which people know best, probably. We wrote about Joe Birmingham, who was very Gagan-like in profile. He was at 6 parishes in about 30 years. Complaints came in from the very beginning. There were at least 50 victims. He has one of the most organized victim groups. It's called Survivors of Joseph Birmingham. He died in the late 80s. We wrote about Ron Paquin, a priest who, again, complaints came in from the very beginning. Paquin actually caused the death of a boy. He was driving back from New Hampshire after a weekend away. Car flipped on a freeway. A boy named Jimmy Francis died. Paquin is now in jail. Paul Shanley, who people probably know as one of the most notorious, because he created for himself a ministry in which he worked exclusively with troubled teenagers, often kids struggling with their sexual identity. He's now awaiting trial. We wrote about Bernie Lane, who ran a treatment center for troubled teens in Littleton, Massachusetts. So that gave us an opportunity again to give some detail. But one thing I'd like to get across today is the volume of priests who did this. Between about January 2002, when we wrote our first Gagan stories, and April 2002, when we were publishing our book, something like 90 priests' names were turned over to Massachusetts law enforcement officials. 170 priests across the country resigned or were placed on leave. To date, I think the Boston Archdiocese has turned over between 150 and 200 files that included accusations. These are some going back years. The file cabinets were spilling out with this. I mean, this argument that it was a few bad apples is just not true. Once in a while, people call us and they say, why was there such a problem in Boston, or why was there such a problem in New England? And that's frustrating for me to hear, because this is not a local or regional problem. We just happened to get the file cabinets open by going to court and finding a judge who agreed to lift a confidentiality seal. So that's, I think, a message I hope people will be left with today.
Thank you, Sasha. Michael Paulson, the Globe's extraordinary religion reporter, has had somewhat of a unique view compared to those of us who wrote almost exclusively about the misdeeds of the priests. Michael covers the church and the cardinal and the chancery, and has been very close to the story all along of how this has affected the church. Michael, we thank you for being here today. He's just back from Rome, where he has been writing about the Vatican and our Pope. And thank you for being here, Michael.
Thank you. I guess I'll start by reminding you all what you must know, which is that this story, these hundreds of stories that we all wrote over the last couple of years, have had a more dramatic impact on this institution, this church, than any story I think any of us have ever been involved with. It had an impact on policy, on personnel, and on perception of the church. On the policy front, both locally and nationally, the church has made quite dramatic changes in the way it responds to allegations of abuse. On the personnel front, you all know it led ultimately to the resignation of the Archbishop of Boston, an unprecedented step, and numerous bishops around the country stepped down because of their own personal misconduct. and it led to the removal of more than 400 priests around the country who had been accused of abuse in various dioceses. And of course, on the perception front, the crisis has dramatically changed the way lay people and priests and even bishops see the church in this country and around the world. My job is to talk a little about the issues that I cover. The future of the church, which is the largest Christian denomination in the world, claims 1 billion adherents. This is not something I can easily do in 4 minutes, so I'm just going to mention a few issues, and then if you want to talk further about them during the question and answer session, we can. On the local front, the first and most significant issue facing the church is preventing a recurrence of the crisis that we've been writing about. The Archdiocese of Boston has put into place new rules for screening priests, for training workers, and has pledged to remove from ministry any priest who is credibly accused of abuse. The Archdiocese has agreed to settle litigation brought by more than 500 people who were affected by the abuse crisis with a price tag of $85 million. That's going to worsen an already existing financial crisis for the Archdiocese. We expect that it will lead to sales of property, to parish closings, to a continuation of some of the school closings that we've seen over the last couple of years. A priority for the Archdiocese and for the new Archbishop is obviously going to be healing for victims. There are hundreds of people, as I say, who are affected by abuse by priests in this area. The Archdiocese has promised to pay for ongoing therapy for them. And the Archdiocese has to work on healing for lay people and priests, many of whom have had their confidence in this institution severely shaken over the last several years. On the national level, the Church has been affected everywhere. The Church, for the first time, passed a national child protection policy this past year. The U.S. Conference of Bishops had been talking about the problem of sexual abuse since 1993, but it wasn't until these stories were published that they finally set about passing a national policy that ultimately requires every diocese to remove priests who are abusive. But perhaps more importantly, the national church is taking several steps that could dramatically change the way we understand what took place over the last several decades. They've commissioned 2 studies, one of which is about the scope of abuse in this country, which is scheduled to be released early next year. And the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has said that he expects the results to be startling in terms of the numbers that it will reveal. They've also agreed to release a study about what they see as the causes of this crisis, which, as you all can imagine, is a very hotly contested issue. And at the Vatican's insistence, they've agreed to an inspection by the Vatican of all American seminaries. These are the institutions where priests are trained. Finally, on the global front, this crisis opened a Pandora's box of issues that have been confronting the Catholic Church in the U.S. and in the West, at least since the 1960s, that are now being discussed much more openly by people at all levels of the Church. Those issues include celibacy. What is the role of requiring most priests to be celibate? Not technically open for discussion in the Church, but it's being discussed increasingly nonetheless. There's a new cardinal who was created last week from Scotland who has said that he believes that the Church ought to be discussing whether priests should be allowed to get married. The role of women in the Church, the role of authority. We've seen locally a new lay organization form, Voice of the Faithful, and a new priests organization, the Boston Priest Forum, which are testing whether or not there is a greater role for lay people and priests in the decision-making power of the Church. The issue of homosexuality, which is hotly contested in terms of whether or not the number of gay men in the priesthood played a role in the scope of this crisis. As Robbie mentioned, I'm just back from Rome. I was there for the last 2 weeks covering the Pope's 25th anniversary of his papacy, as well as the beatification of Mother Teresa. And as you can imagine, with the Pope being so sick, there's quite a bit of discussion in and around the Vatican about an upcoming transition at the Vatican, about who the candidates are likely to be for the next Pope and what kind of changes that will entail. And one thing that we'll be watching is whether, as there is transition at the Vatican, as well as in the Archdiocese of Boston, whether we'll see an increasing emphasis on a return to orthodoxy, as is being called for by the conservative forces in the Church, or whether there's a push for greater reform, as is being pushed for by progressive forces in the Church. Those are the issues I'll be watching in coming months and years, and with that, I think I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, Kevin, Tom, Steve, and Sasha. This is an issue on which we think we've just sort of touched on just a few of the issues, and it's one that whenever we talk about it, people want to engage and ask questions and throw brickbats our way. So please, if you can ask a question, and please use the microphone. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Linda Morris, and I live in Newton, and I've been wanting to find out some time and call the full time. Could you talk about the process, or you said you looked for a judge?
That was poor wording. I mean,
okay.
we coincidentally got a certain judge who felt that it was in the public interest to have that case unsealed. The history was that the case against John Gagan had been sealed by the court at the request of the church. The church had argued it was private. A judge agreed and sealed the case. When we went to look, in the spring of 2002, Cardinal Law had admitted in a routine legal filing that he knew before he sent Gagan to his final assignment at St. Julian Weston that he was aware that he had allegedly molested 7 boys. That was big news because that changed the story from one about priests who abused children to one about church leaders who covered up for priests who abused children. The Globe had a new editor at the time, Marty Barron. A columnist had written about this case file being sealed. Marty Barron said, "Why is this sealed? Shouldn't we challenge it?" The Globe lawyers went to court. It took many months, and we began our research beforehand, but ultimately a judge agreed that it was in the public interest to have that case file open. We didn't judge shop.
Oh, okay, but what about, I'm wondering about the process of crafting the request to the court. Did you find a lot of false leads? Was it pretty clear from the beginning how to state it? Or the fact that you were able to get a judge to force the Archdiocese to give up those documents was really the crucial step. And I've been wondering a lot about all aspects of that. Thank you.
Let me address that. We have an extraordinarily good First Amendment lawyer, Jonathan Albano, and once he was asked to look into this, he forged an argument that notwithstanding whatever rights the church thought it had to keep this information about its personnel records secret, that there was, given the issues involved, an overriding public interest in having access to those records. And since our agencies of government, including our courts, normally operate publicly, the judge, after considering this, decided that in fact the records should be released. And the same judge was then, after the story broke, given stewardship of all the claims, and using the same legal justification which has been upheld, ruled that the personnel records of all the other priests had to go to the lawyers and be filed publicly in court and made available, which is why so much more is known about what happened in Boston than in any other venue in the country.
I want to add about the judge, talking about the culture of deference collapsing or at least eroding. Judge Constance Sweeney, who made these rulings, was a product of Catholic education. She went to Catholic grammar school, she went to Catholic high school, she went to a Catholic college. But she ruled that, obviously, that this was in the public interest. So it was just another example of just the power structure, the courts, everybody in legal circles have been part of keeping the cover-up going because it kept everything secret. She was the one that actually unsealed the records.
And I want to note quickly that we wrote a story about the many judges who over the years sealed various abuse cases. And one of those judges we were able to interview, and she acknowledged that she believes she probably did that in error, now when she realizes the extent of the problem.
Yes, a question, please.
Presuming the extent of the prevalence of the sexual abuse was extraordinary and the nature of the Catholic Church hasn't changed in its secrecy and self-protectiveness, and alluding to the issues Mr. Paulson brought up, some people blame Vatican II, some people blame the sexual permissiveness of society, some people blame celibacy. Did your personal investigations give you any insight into your own beliefs about what happened? I mean, why it's suddenly was so prevalent and the sexual abuse, was suddenly so prevalent.
There may be 6 different opinions on this issue, and within the room, 50 different opinions. Michael, why don't you go first on this? This is obviously an issue.
This is a very difficult question, and as I say, the Bishops' Conference itself is starting to grapple this question of what caused this crisis and whether, in fact, the problem in the Catholic Church was worse than in other institutions. We did try and take a look to compare the prevalence of abuse within Catholicism to other religious denominations, and we couldn't find anything comparable in any other denomination. I think you have to say there are multiple factors that contributed to what took place here. Clearly, there was inadequate screening of candidates for the priesthood, particularly in the 50s and 60s. There was an inadequate response to complaints about abuse from parents and even from other priests and sometimes nuns. The Archdiocese would hear that a priest was of concern and would not act to remove that priest from jobs in which he had access to children, so priests were allowed to continue to violate children. But then there are these issues of secrecy. Some people argue that there was a culture in which Catholics were encouraged not to take on the church, not to bring scandal on the church, not to question the actions of a priest or the decisions of a bishop. The church was very interested in preventing scandal, in preventing anything that might damage its image in the broader society, obviously a strategy that ultimately backfired quite badly. And the role of issues like celibacy and sexuality and gender are very hotly debated. People tend to come at those issues with their own preconceived ideologies, and you find that both from the left and right, people read into the crisis the problems that they already saw before the crisis began. Does somebody else want to jump in here?
I think I'd just say generally that why it happened, I think, is the most complicated issue of it all and probably unanswerable in many ways.
As one among us, among several of us who was raised Catholic, and in my case went to 12 years of Catholic school, I've reflected a lot on the issue of celibacy. And there are a lot of priests who would disagree with me on this, but I think of a church that recruits people and essentially says to them, if you want to be a priest, you cannot have emotional or deep emotional attachments. You have to live alone. You cannot marry. It really narrows the pool from which the church is drawing its priests, and in a way which I believe contributed to this. As Michael said, the incidence of this, we can find no match for it in other congregations. And speaking roughly of the numbers, over the period of time which we studied, about 50 years, roughly 5 to 7% of the priests in the Boston Archdiocese were accused of, in that period, of sexually abusing minors. Yes, ma'am, please.
Hello, my name is Patricia, and I'm from the Malden, Medford, Somerville area. That covers it all. Raised by Sisters of St. Joseph, and my 3 children, who are all grown now, they were raised by nuns and priests in Malden. I have a question that's been pondering me since the very beginning time when this first started coming out in the newspapers. Both my boys were altar boys growing up, choir boys, very involved in the church. We all were, choir, etc. So when this came out, I asked one of my grown sons, who happens to be in law enforcement now, do you ever recall any of the priests, Father so-and-so and so on, ever doing anything inappropriate or that you questioned or that you would have come home and told? He said, well, one time Father so-and-so whacked me over the head, and I said, he did? What did he do that for? He says, well, I dropped the chalice in the sacristy. So probably that was justifiable cause for whacking him on the head. I think what I'm questioning is going back to a number of years where you people talked about today, that parents went to either their pastor or some member of the clergy and reported allegations or stories that their children came home with. They in turn sat down with whatever member of the clergy and told their story, however real it was to them, however real it was to the children, and then accepted money on the basis that they would never reveal their allegations, their knowledge of the stories their children had told them. What I question is, while that is on a moral issue, this is also a crime. And I wanted to know if any of the board members have confronted any of these parents. They took the money, and what did they do with the money? Was any of the parents ever questioned about the money that they took in lieu of their children's mental and physical welfare? Granted, they may have signed documents. I can only tell in my own case and growing up with my own children, I know full well my husband and I would never have gone that route. This is a crime. We would have very clearly sought law enforcement as an answer to that. And as you've said here, perhaps some of these parents, I don't know if the word is accountable, but to take thousands and thousands of dollars, and a lot of these people that were allegedly, or they were abused, they have still grown into be troubled adults, and they in turn perhaps will abuse other people. So my question is, I wonder if anything was pursued along that line as far as the monetary and financial rewards or payoffs that they received in light of their children's welfare. As I said, I know from my own background, raised in a parochial, and my husband, the way we felt when our children came home, we would have sought out law enforcement first. Thank you.
What we found for the dozens of victims who had called and stepped forward and to talk to us is invariably they did not come from stable homes. Invariably, the children who were abused came from broken homes or came from homes where the parents the children were not in stable family environments. As a result, they had no place in order to sit at a table or a mother or a father who would draw them out and would believe them. And those kids, it was almost like those were the kids that the priests, the clergy, knew needed some stability or some comfort. And those are the kids that the priests would focus their attention on.
The majority of them were?
More than the majority, the bulk of them.
I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, the bulk of them. So, so that's one reason that you didn't have families saying, "What's going on here? This is a crime to my child. I'm going to the authorities." Invariably, the parents also were told that this is, or the parent, or the child too, who may have grown up by now and was bringing the complaint to the church, was told that this was a singular event. This was just one time, and that he or she or the parent would be doing harm to a wonderful institution, which it is. You know, one thing that this institution does is provide extraordinary support to the poor and to the homeless in our society, and that speaking up would bring scandal upon the church and would in the end hurt the church. So invariably, the parents did not seek to make it public.
One thing that we ought to make clear, and the book does, is that from our experience, the vast majority of the children who were abused did not tell their parents at the time. They didn't tell their siblings. They were afraid to. And in fact, once this scandal broke open, we received calls from more than 300 victims. And in many of those cases, they had kept this inside them for years and had lived with this and were telling, for the first time, their story to reporters. And so by the time they came forward, whether it was in the 90s or prior, most often the criminal statute of limitations had long since run out, and the only remedy was this civil action.
Yeah, I think I'm referring to a long time ago where millions of dollars were paid out to various are guardians or parents or whatever.
But you know, people, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we saw that many payments until the late 80s and early 90s, and the payments typically weren't to families. They were to now adult men who were reporting abuse that happened when they were younger. So I think that's sort of a misperception that there were families, moms, dads, and kids taking big lump sums.
Sometimes
and also, I mean, we have talked to a lot of parents who to this day beat themselves up for not having done more. On the other hand, some did everything they could think of. They went as far up the food chain in the church as they can. They had meetings at the chancery. They were assured it would be taken care of. The priest disappeared. Years later, they learned the priest went from the South Shore to the North Shore. And we have at least one or two police records. I think someone in Hull, a police officer in Hull, found a priest parked with a kid, priest pants down, midnight in a parking lot. And you know, he sent the priest home. He went to the bishop the next day and said, "You have a problem, take care of it." So I think people encountered police who didn't want to get involved.
It's fear, and it becomes a conspiracy of silence.
I think so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Val Mulcahy, and first of all, thank you for the work you've done. I started off not being encouraged by what I was reading, and as it went on, more and more found a need to concentrate on it. So I'm grateful to you for bringing my attention to it. The question I have is that I can understand that the need to avoid a scandal in any large institution is probably reasonable within an extent, provided there is an internal methodology of handling it, or some balance within that institution. Could you tell me if you found anything in your investigations, or what you found in your investigations, that showed what was going on inside the church? What pressures were there that were seeing this and working towards a solution towards that, or was there anything at all?
Tom and Sasha.
Well, typically what would happen was, in reading the tens of thousands of pages that we now have at our disposal, is there would be an accusation, a complaint. The priest would be immediately brought to the chancery by the cardinal's delegate, the person designated to investigate, and there would be a meeting. There'd be notes taken, and very often the priest would be sent to for examination at one of the treatment centers, either outside of Washington, or there was one in Canada and one in Hartford. But until very recently, the priest would, as I say, be evaluated, and the church sometimes would argue for the evaluation it wanted, which was that this priest was fit to be returned to service, and very many times that's what happened. So they did have a mechanism, and in the early 90s they formalized the policy, but they just didn't. It was a toothless policy, and it did not obtain the protections that the architect of that policy, who's Bishop McCormick in New Hampshire now, had hoped.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, please.
I want to respond to this woman who was up before me. When are we ever going to learn to stop blaming the victims? When she said something about the parents' responsibility, God, you know what? I heard cardinal law. That was his thing. The parents didn't do this, the parents didn't do that. Are we ever, as a society, going to stop blaming the victims and get to the real culprits here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody want to comment on that? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. First of all, congratulations to all of you on the Pulitzer Prize. Enormously well-deserved and really gutsy. It occurs to me that the people who built this place are saying to themselves, "We told you so." But the talk has been about how could it happen in Boston? How did it happen in Boston? Boston Globe today, 50 cents, page B1. It's about benefits for same-sex partners. I'm going to read one paragraph, and I will riff on it. A top deputy of House Speaker Thomas Finneran said yesterday he sees a window of opportunity to greatly expand benefits for same-sex couples in the next year. I hope you're sitting for this. Now that the state's Catholic bishops have signaled a willingness to discuss granting benefits to domestic partners. Whatever happens inside the church, whatever the causes inside the church are internal. But when you have that written about something going on up at the State House 4 blocks away, there's the other side of this undue deference that hasn't gone away yet. And I'd like to hear your comments on that. I was raised as a Catholic, by the way.
Well,
Thank you.
That's a fascinating issue. I actually take that and other things that have happened since this scandal exploded into public view as evidence that the church's clout, its credibility in the public arena has been seriously eroded. And I'd ask my colleagues whether they believe 2 years ago the bishops would have, in effect, come halfway and said, no, we're against same-sex unions, but we'll consider supporting benefits for domestic partners. Kevin?
Well, I mean, the other thing, I think I used the word collapse in terms of the culture of deference. I think a better word is erosion. And the reality, we have to get back to the reality, is that this is the only metropolitan area in the United States where over half of the population is Catholic. The legislature, I think, is still about 70% Catholic, which is, so the influence is not going to drop overnight. But the reality is, I mean, I just look at my own upbringing. I mean, on Fridays during Lent, no one ate meat. You know, you didn't miss Mass, or if you missed Mass, you went to confession. All these things that Catholics live by, it isn't like that anymore. And so it's the same way when it comes to politicians. Are they voting the way their bishops tell them to vote? I don't see any evidence of that to the extent that maybe a generation ago. But this is an evolutionary process. And so it's not like because of this scandal, all of a sudden, people who were raised Catholic are not culturally Catholic. And that is why the bishops still retain, whatever the bishops say, we're going to generally, if it's a big moral issue or a big societal issue, it's front page news. And so we shouldn't, I don't think we should overstate, as Robbie said, I think their influence has diminished, but it still is a giant influence because it's, you know, every week people are still going to church and listening to what their bishops say.
Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. Sir, we have time for one more question, and it's yours.
In the many discussions I have had on this issue, I have tried to find the proverbial silver lining. I'm basically a half-full person. And the best I've come up with is something like, these things aren't happening anymore. If they do happen, they'll be very quickly dealt with. If there are cover-ups, they'll be very quickly exposed, and we should be grateful for that. People I have talked to haven't always been convinced. I was wondering how much validity you think there is to my reasoning on that.
Michael?
Well, I guess if you want to look for a silver lining, you have led me directly into a quote I brought from the Pope in his initial response to this crisis, and this is what he said last April when he brought all the cardinals of the United States over to talk to him about this. He said, "We must be confident that this time of trial will bring a purification of the entire Catholic community, a purification that is urgently needed if the Church is to preach more effectively." I think many Catholic officials have said that they believe that this crisis is going to improve the Church because there obviously was a problem. Children were being harmed, and the hope is that as a result of this crisis, fewer children will be hurt.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, sir, for that concluding question. And on behalf of all of us at the Globe, thank you all very much for being with us today. For anyone who's interested, we do have copies of the Globe in the far corner of the church. And if any of you have any further questions you'd like to put to the individual calendars,
Betrayal: The Crisis in the Catholic Church is available in paperback from Back Bay Books, an imprint of Little Brown and Company. To learn more, visit twbookmark.com.
Thank you.
It's Book TV's 5th anniversary fall, and this weekend we're in Boston for the Boston Globe Book Fair. Betrayal: The Crisis in the Catholic Church is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting of the Boston Globe Spotlight team. And you're looking live inside the Old South Boston Meeting House, where members of the team We'll discuss the scandal and its ongoing impact on the church. This is live coverage on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Good afternoon from the Old South Meeting House in Boston, and welcome to today's program of the Boston Globe Book Festival, our annual celebration of great writing and great reading. My name is David Mehegan from the Globe staff. Our series continues tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Charles Hotel in Cambridge, as novelist William Martin reads from his new book, Harvard Yard, and next Wednesday night at 6 p.m. at Boston's Faneuil Hall, with Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. The center of today's program is a book entitled Betrayal: The Crisis in the Catholic Church, by 6 members of the Globe staff, with whom I will introduce to you in a moment. It gives me great pleasure is the usual phrase in introductions such as these, but I suspect that pleasant is not the apt word for the work these reporters and authors have done over the last 2 years. I am sure they would say that it was satisfying and rewarding, but also appalling, revolting, and dispiriting. Probably not pleasant. In the hundreds of stories which they wrote, and in the book that followed, the
issue of clergy sexual abuse had been kicking around in this country since the mid-1980s. But it was a story that was always treated as an isolated incident, and the Catholic hierarchy had its interest in having it seen that way. One case that we dealt with in the book and in our reporting was in 1991, when the case of a former priest named James Porter, who had molested hundreds of children, came to light. He was a priest in the Fall River Diocese. That case was dealt with as an isolated case. And in fact, when the reporting of the Globe and others sought to suggest that it might be more than that, Cardinal Law suggested that it was part of an anti-Catholic agenda, and that this was something that, as he said, he called the power of God down on the media, and especially the Boston Globe. And most Catholics were prepared to accept that. They did see that maybe as piling on, that there was maybe too many stories about one case. What changed in the 10 years between the Porter case and when the Spotlight team exposed in 2001 the numbers involved, and showed beyond a reasonable doubt that this was not isolated, that it was widespread, and that this was covered up, is that ordinary Catholics responded. They were the ones who were talking about this at Mass. They were the ones who were talking among themselves and reading the stories. And it wasn't what the Globe said. It was the records that the Globe obtained. It was the Church's own words. It was the Cardinal's own words. And those are words that held comfort for the abusers and none for the abused. And that resonated with ordinary Catholics. So that became an internal pressure, which continued on. And one of the stories, the episodes we tell in the book, was in February of 2001, when Cardinal Law convened what you would call a kitchen cabinet, ad hoc advisors, very powerful people in business and finance.
In 2001, our assignment was to determine how much the Church knew about his serial molestation of so many children over so many years. What we quickly discovered was that Geoghegan was only one among scores of priests whose sexual abuse of children had been covered up for decades by a succession of Boston cardinals and bishops. Today, almost 2 years after we began publishing extensive stories about this, we know that in this archdiocese alone, more than 200 priests have faced credible allegations of sexual abuse over 60 years. In 2002, the Globe published more than 800 news stories about the scandal, the vast bulk of them written by the 8 of us. In early April, in a moment of weakness, we allowed a senior editor to convince us that the news story was ebbing and that we ought to write a book. And in less than 5 weeks, we did, even as we discovered the story was not ebbing at all. Even now, 16 months after the book was published, it retains all of its relevancy. It contains much of the history, background, context, nuance, and detail that cannot be easily shoehorned into any number of news stories. For the next 20 minutes, my colleagues who did most of the writing will tell you about some of the book's highlights, and then we will be happy to take your questions for the balance of our time. Kevin Cullen will start with an explanation of the church culture that helped to make such a long-running cover-up possible. Kevin?
Thanks, Robert. We were often asked during the reporting and the writing of the book and after why this story took so long to come out, and why did it come out when it came out in the Globe. Actually, the whole story, the issue...
Authors of Betrayal, the Crisis in the Catholic Church. Walter Robinson.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind and warm introduction. And our thanks from the Globe to all of you for being inside this historic place on what may be one of the last autumn days here in Boston that can be spent outdoors without wool socks. It may seem odd to have 6 journalists all up here together to discuss just one book. In fact, the book has 8 authors. 2 of us, Matt Carroll and Michael Resendez, could not be here today. For the book's publisher, there were so many writers involved that our names were shuffled off to the back cover of the hardcover edition. And when the paperback was published, our names disappeared inside, buried at the bottom of the acknowledgments on page 276. That's page 276, in case anybody's looking. But I suppose that's rough justice. The book is, after all, an effort not by any one of us, or even just the 8 of us, but it's an obligation we all felt at the Globe, in the midst of a turbulent moment in the Church's history, to pause ever so briefly to put together the story in the larger context it deserved. Before my colleagues give you a hint of what's in the book, let me briefly set the context. The Globe's investigative team set out in mid-2001 to investigate the case of the notorious priest-pedophile John Gagan, whose recent murder in prison is yet another horrific punctuation mark in the evolution of this scandal.
Painfully and painstakingly documented the sexual abuse of children by dozens of Catholic priests in the Archdiocese of Boston over the last generation and more. They revealed as well the pattern of denial, enabling, and cover-up by church leadership, revelations which have led to the profound changes in the Catholic Church in the Boston area and in the United States. Their reporting and disclosures resulted in an unprecedented resignation of a Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, and it earned for them and the Globe the 2003 Pulitzer Prize in Journalism for Public Service. Speaking as one who knew 3 of the abusive priests personally and never would have suspected them, I need not tell you that the shock of these disclosures can hardly be overstated. The repercussions of the loss of trust will be felt for years to come in the Church and in the community generally. Leading our presentation today is Walter Robinson, leader of the investigative group known as the Boston Globe Spotlight Team. And to my right, in order, are several Globe writers who contributed to this project and the book: Sasha Pfeiffer, Stephen Kirkjian, Tom Farragher, Kevin Cullen, and Michael Paulson. There will be time for questions after their remarks, and I would ask those who have questions to come to the microphone so that the broadcast audience can hear you. And there will be a book signing after the program as well. I invite you now, please, to welcome and to listen to the